Get yourself seated. We're about to get started on a phenomenal afternoon plenary. It's been a good day. Has it been a good day? How many of you feeling fired up? How many of you are feeling like we need to take some action? I don't hear enough spirit in the room. How many of us here feel like we need to take some action? So this next segment in our agenda is intended to get us thinking about how we can use everything that we've heard and learned about today, everything that we know about the issues, and start talking about what it is that we can do about it. But I first want to introduce myself. My name is Cynthia Orellana. I am on the Peace Committee, and I'm also the director of the Office of Community Partnerships at UMass Boston. And I'm going to be your MC for the rest of the afternoon because Margot actually had to catch a flight back to DC. I also am the proud daughter of Salvadoran immigrants, Ana y Alcides Orellana. I am the last of 4 children. I am the first born in this country. I am the first to go to college, and I am currently a doctoral student at UMass Boston. I'm also born and raised in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I have lived all of my life, and I live to this day. I attended public K through 12 education. I went to colleges and universities in Greater Boston. And why am I sharing all of this personal data with you? Because this issue is personal. Because many of us who are in this room today are people who are the data that we've been talking about. Some of us have had to defeat some very large challenges. We've had to defeat odds to get to where we are today. And as some of my fellow colleagues shared earlier, there is not a lack of leadership in the state of Massachusetts to address this issue. What there is a lack of will. So we have the personal power to do something about the issues that we're talking about today. And so this issue is deeply personal. And so in the Latino tradition, I had to start with a story of who I am. I also wanted to say that there's enough of us like me in this state who are born and bred and raised here and want to continue to live in Massachusetts to contribute to the thriving of this community. And so unless we can address policies that support young people in this state to be the future leaders of this Commonwealth, and I'm referring to this emerging majority of Latinos in this country, then we are putting ourselves in a position where we will completely falter. So we have to do something about it. Are you with me? So I am in a position where I get to introduce our keynote address for this afternoon. And I was actually just chatting with Dr. Noguera and informing him that I came across his work in my previous role with the Department of Higher Education when I was working on issues related to males and males of color here in the state. Shout out to my folks from Springfield, Massachusetts, who presented earlier today on 100 Mills to College. These are the folks on the ground really trying to do this transformative work. But anyways, I came across Dr. Noguera's scholarship when we were trying to build up these policies, and so I am especially honored and very delighted to be able to introduce you to the crowd today. So, Dr. Noguera is a distinguished professor of education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. His research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He's the author of 11 books and over 200 articles and monographs, and I'm trying to follow in your step. I just submitted my first manuscript to a journal. I have a long way to go. He serves on the boards of numerous national and local organizations and appears as a regular commentator on educational issues on CNN, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and other national news outlets. Prior to joining the faculty at UCLA, he served as a tenured professor and holder of endowed chairs at New York University, Harvard University, and the University of California, Berkeley. He also served as trustee for the State University of New York, SUNY, as an appointee of the governor. And in 2014, he was elected to the National Academy of Education. Dr. Noguera recently received numerous awards, including from the Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Science and the National Association of Secondary Principals for his research and advocacy efforts aimed at fighting poverty. Thank you for being with us today and for all that you do. Please join me in giving him a warm Massachusetts welcome.
Buenas tardes. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I was saying to Cynthia, I said, seems like all the high-level officials have already gone. She said, no, but the important people are still here. So thank you, important people, for sticking around. Because a lot of my comments are directed at what's wrong in Massachusetts. And I say that as a person who has lived here, who was very much directly involved in education policy when these new policies that are guiding the state were being conceived and then implemented, and a person who was very critical of them then. And I'm here to say that many of my criticisms are still on target. So I wanted to ask you a question. How can Massachusetts be #1 in education and still do so poorly for its Latino students? Okay. I want you to think about that, because I think what it suggests is that if you keep doing what you're doing, nothing will change. Okay? I tried to explain that to Marco Davis, a friend, colleague, when he was at the Obama administration, and they launched Brothers Keeper. And I was so glad to see that the administration wanted to take on the challenges facing males of color. And I said, but you have to ask yourselves, how come your policies actually made the situation for males of color worse? Because you're not going to be able to solve this unless you shift the policy. Well, as we know, they never did. And it actually got worse once Trump got elected, because the policies took an even more disastrous turn. So the good news about education is the federal government's role is limited, even more limited now in the Trump administration, because they don't care a lot about education, which means states have more control and states have more ability to set the direction, and there are several states that are moving in a different direction. California, where I live now, has an equity-based funding formula, so for the first time in the state's history, they are actually putting more resources into the communities that need more, which sounds like what we should be doing, right? But except the United States is one of few countries that systematically spends more money on affluent kids than poor kids. And anyone who says money doesn't matter usually has a lot of money, right? Okay. But it's not just California, it's Washington State, Oregon State, New Mexico, where I'm advisor to the governor. They are last in the nation, and they realize they need a total shift. Nevada's trying to change. Several states now are on the verge of trying to change because they realize that what they've been doing hasn't worked. I was talking to the commissioner, new commissioner. It's interesting. Puerto Ricans are commissioners of education in several states. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania. It's amazing, huh? Go Puerto Rico. Hopefully you can help Puerto Rico too, because Puerto Rico is in real trouble. But I was trying to explain to the new commissioner of Pennsylvania, I said, Connecticut, I said, you know, Connecticut is one of the highest spending states in the country, and all of your urban districts are failing and have been for years. So again, you're going to have to shift direction. So here's the problem. Many of those in leadership roles don't know how to shift because they're stuck. They're stuck on No Child Left Behind, even though it left so many kids behind. So let me start with a quick story. 2002, or maybe 2001, before the state, Massachusetts, implemented MCAS, I was asked to participate in a debate before the state legislature about the merits of the new policy. And I was debating with an attorney who represented those who were advocating for the policy. And I said, you know, there's not a single district in the state that can guarantee that the kids who failed the exam had actually been prepared. Think about that for a moment. That means to be prepared, it means you had had a teacher who was qualified to teach you, you've been exposed to the material and the courses. And he said, that might be right, but we're going to do it anyway. And they did. And when the first results from the MCAS were announced, about 6,000 kids who had taken the test repeatedly failed again, and the state declared victory. Victory for high standards. And you can only understand that victory if you understand who those 6,000 kids were. 1/3 were kids with learning disabilities. That is, kids we knew in advance were not able to access the material because their IEP told us that. The other 1/3 were kids who couldn't speak English. Hard to take an exam and a test in a language that you're not fluent in. And the other 1/3 were from districts that we knew in advance were struggling. The large urban districts, and the not so large, like Holyoke and Springfield and Boston and Lawrence. Should we have been surprised that those districts had high rates of failure? I'd spent years working in Boston, and we were at schools like Dorchester High, where over 75% of the kids had failed the exam twice. Twice. And go into classrooms where they're doing test prep, double period test prep in math and literacy, because at the time that's what we tested it. Sounds serious until you go into the classroom. And you see kids brushing their hair and playing cards, and you realize, guess what? This is not serious at all. I remember talking to the principal at Dorchester High. I said, I think you're going to have more failure here. He said, you know what the big problem in our school is? He said, we have too many doors. I said, what? He said, we have too many doors. We have over 26 doors at this school. I have to have someone at each door to keep the kids in. I said, do you ever wonder why they want to escape so badly? I raise that because I think we're asking the wrong questions about education. And if we shift the focus on the questions we ask, we might get different results. So let me start by just establishing the context. The context is that we're in a period of great backlash against immigrant youth. And that has an impact on Latinos in particular, because many families are affected, and not just those who are undocumented, because in many families where people are citizens like Cynthia, they have relatives who might be undocumented. And that creates stress. It's creating a climate of fear. It's leading to and contributing to bullying against our kids who are assumed to be illegal in this country. That impacts performance. And although this state, like the rest of the country, could not survive without immigrant labor, could not survive, right? Because the whole healthcare industry is dependent on immigrant labor, the restaurants, the hotels, the construction industry, agriculture. Old people would die right now throughout this country if immigrants left. Because who's taking care of our elders in those low-wage jobs? But we don't have an honest conversation about immigration in America, even though so many Americans are just a few generations off the boat. And so we have a context in which inequality and political threats are also affecting the climate in which learning takes place. And if we don't face up to the ways in which that shapes opportunities and our students' experiences, we're not going to be able to change things, because we have to understand the constraints we're under. Latinos are the fastest growing population in Massachusetts, which is a good thing for Massachusetts, because like the rest of the country, Massachusetts has an aging population. And if you don't have replacement workers, guess what happens? There's not enough workers to take care of the old people. That's a dilemma we're facing throughout America today. We need more people in the workforce because we have baby boomers in retirement. And someone's got to work to take care of them. That's the way Social Security works. It's mathematical. When Social Security was created in 1964, there were 28 workers to one retiree. Today, there are 3 workers to one retiree. That's a problem. That's the reason why I always say the strongest advocates for educating our kids should be old people, older white people, because their futures depend on this generation of kids getting educated and employed to continue to support the retirement system. The problem is that we don't realize how interdependent we are. And so we believe that the problems in Holyoke are the problems of Holyoke, like the problems of Lawrence, not the state's problems. Because if we treated them like the state's problems, we would respond differently than we do right now. Question we should ask is, could improving educational opportunities for Latinos help the state? And I think the answer there is pretty clear. It's pretty clear that unless you can find ways to educate more Latinos, you're going to continue to have these pockets of poverty. You're going to continue to have lots of people who are unable to contribute to themselves and their communities, and we're going to continue to see lots and lots of people who have talents and ability but are not able to use those talents to help themselves. So I came across this article in preparing for my visit. I was put in Latinos in Massachusetts, and you know what I found? USA Today rated Massachusetts the worst state in the country for Latinos. Now, I'm not a fan of USA Today. I rarely read it unless there's nothing else to be read, right? So I said, maybe this is fake news. How could Massachusetts be the worst? Well, here's why. When you look at indicators like household income and the ability to own a home, what you find is the gaps between white people in Massachusetts and Latinos is the widest in the country. This is a high wealth state with a highly educated population. There are more colleges and universities in Massachusetts than in any other state. When I lived in Cambridge, I used to think that, if just by moving to Cambridge, you should get smart. Because Harvard and MIT own most of the property there. So why isn't it that they should have the best public schools in the country? But that's not the case. Especially, again, if you're poor, immigrant, black, Latino, or even when they used to have poor white people in Cambridge way back too. And they weren't doing too well either. There's books written about them. And that's because too often, instead of serving as a means to escape poverty, our schools are implicated in the reproduction of inequality. Think about that. Sean Reardon, an economist at Stanford, just released a study. Look up his work at Stanford 2 weeks ago on the effects, the ways in which poverty drives achievement. The strongest predictor for how well our students will do in school is how much money the family earns. If you combine household income with parent education, particularly the education of the mother, you can predict with great consistency how well kids will do. Now that's the statistics, and in this case, statistics don't lie. But we also know there are exceptions. Cynthia's an exception. I'm an exception. And I'll bet you there are others in this room today that are the exceptions. How many of you are first-generation college students? Look around the room. How many come from a family where neither parent graduated from high school? Look around the room. Mine too. My parents sent all 6 of us to college. Harvard, Brown, Cornell, Berkeley. Those of us who raise our hands are proof your background should not determine what you can accomplish in education if you have access to a good education. And that's the question we should be asking. Just look at the dropout rates when we see that in Massachusetts, Latinos continue to lag behind, but what we don't ask is why. And if you don't ask why, what you're likely to do is to confuse the symptoms of a problem with the cause of a problem. Okay? And we know from health that if you focus on the symptom but don't address the cause, you know what happens? Sometimes the problem gets worse. You go to the doctor, you say, I have a stomach ache, and the doctor says, take Tums, but you actually have a bleeding ulcer. Guess what happens? You'll get even sicker. Well, that's what's happening in education. Let's think about the dropout rate. We have lots of districts with high dropout rates, although we've seen graduation rates rise, but again, in high poverty areas, the dropout rates are still quite high. And there are people who think, well, what those kids need are mentors, or what they need is truant officers to get them back in school. And LA, the superintendent said, we're going to put up ads all over the city saying, send your kids to school, as if the parents forgot. You know what the number one reason why immigrant kids will drop out of school is? They drop out to work. That's the number one reason. They drop out because the family needs help. They drop out because they've got to pay bills. It's actually not an irresponsible decision, is it? Especially if you know I'm going to head to a low-wage job anyway. Why wait to graduation to go work at Walmart? If the education you've received is not providing other opportunities and options so that a young person can see, oh, with my education, I could help my family and help my community, then some will choose to leave. And let's be clear, in some schools, some kids are encouraged to leave. They may not be encouraged, not be told officially, don't come back, but one way to raise your test scores is to get rid of people who bring them down, isn't it? And if for the kids who are struggling, the kids who have behavior challenges, a lot of folks, they're not too upset if they don't come. And so we have perverse incentives not to keep young people in school. And if we don't address those, then nothing will change. If we don't find ways to address the lack of diversity in our schools amongst the staff, people who know how to communicate with the families, to let the families know you're welcome here and that are committed to being responsive to the needs of the communities and of the children, then we will continue to see kids who become alienated and disengaged and who end up out of school, out of work. These are what they now call the structurally disenfranchised. And across America, between the ages of 18 and 25, there are over 5 million individuals who are structurally disenfranchised, neither working nor in school. Many of them are in prison or in and out. But a whole lot are laying on your couch. How many of you know some of those structurally disenfranchised people at home? Well, we can change that too if we intervene earlier. If we figure out how to make schools matter, if we figure out how to address the external pressures that young people are faced with. So I'll just give you one example. A colleague of mine, Kristen Luker, did research on teen pregnancy. She was focused on teen pregnancy because one of the strongest predictors of a life in poverty is having a child while you're a teenager. And so she wanted to know, why are middle-class girls having babies, less babies than low-income girls? And she does the research, and she interviews lots of young women, and what she finds is that sex is not the reason, though clearly sex is involved. But the big difference is not that the girls aren't having sex, because middle-class girls are having sex too. The big difference is your aspirations. If you think you're going to college, you think having a baby at 15 is not a good idea. You put it off. And as some of you might know, maybe directly from experience, educated women have babies later, sometimes too late, right? Because then it's hard to have them, right? Wait until you're 50 to have a first child, this can be a challenge. But if you come from a family where your mom had a baby as a teenager, and where that's the norm in the community, she's interviewing girls who are saying, well, if I have a baby, I'll be more responsible. If I have a baby, I'll have someone to love. And you're thinking, you're a 15-year-old. What are you thinking? They're thinking like 15-year-olds. Here's something we've known for a long time. Kids who think they're going nowhere behave differently than kids who think they're going somewhere. Your aspirations affect your behavior, affect the choices you make. How many of our kids come from families where they have an incarcerated parent and are not afraid of prison because they know they have relatives in prison, they have friends in prison? I had a kid tell me when I was in the Bronx, he said, I can't wait to go to prison. I said, why? He said, I'll get my teeth fixed. They have dentists in the prison. If you're not afraid of prison, because your aspirations are so cloudy, so murky, then there's a real problem that education should have addressed a lot earlier. So we've got to figure out how to do it differently. As I said already, we should be particularly concerned about our young men, because the evidence is pretty clear. You educate women and you can reduce poverty. And women are outperforming males on a whole number of indicators across race. It's true for Latinos, it's true for all groups. I can name several schools that serve all girls that are excellent and serve low-income girls. Right? I'm on the board of a group called the Young Women's Leadership Academy, and there are several outstanding schools for young women. I can name very few schools for boys that are excellent, very few, especially for boys of color. And I would say part of it is because we don't understand the ways in which masculinity and the way it's been constructed often results in young men seeing intellectual pursuits as being at odds with being masculine. So we got a lot of young men who think it's better to work than to study, better to play ball than to study. And even if they're not even any good at ball, they still think that that's a better option. I want to be a hip-hop star. Again, your aspirations influence the choices you make. Schools have to be a place where we nurture the aspirations. Otherwise, nothing changes. If the stereotypes in our society are not challenged directly and explicitly, then the stereotypes invade our schools. And the kids start to actually believe what others say about them and embrace it, internalize it. Game over. And so we need to think about how to challenge this. We need to think about what needs to change in this state for Latinos to experience greater gains. We need to ask, what can universities do? Here we are at a great public university. You have more universities and colleges than any other state. What role are they playing to address this problem? Nice to hold a conference here. What happens when the conference is over? Are universities places where our educators can come for help and advice? And finally, what about the community? How do we make sure that community organizations, that parents, the people who are directly impacted closest to the issues are also heard and considered when we are thinking through how to approach things differently? Because we can't do it without the community. You know, if there's nothing else we learned over the last several years of school reform, you can't do reforms to people. You must do it with them. Right? Because if you don't do it with them, even ideas that have some basis in fact and it could make sense may not be embraced because they've been imposed. And so we need to figure out how to approach this differently. One of the things we should have figured out long term ago is that schools can't address poverty by themselves. Because when you expect schools, because poverty is not simply an economic issue, it's a social issue, it's a psychological issue, it's an issue that affects housing, it's an issue that affects our quality of life, it shows up in trauma amongst children. If you don't provide the schools who are serving the poorest kids with adequate resources, then in effect, you're asking teachers to be social workers and psychologists and surrogate parents. And guess what? They can't do it all and teach the academic subjects. So one of the reasons why the schools serving the poorest kids are usually the schools that are failing is because they need more help. And it sounds obvious, but that's not what they've gotten. We've been locked in a battle in education between the reformers and those who've been calling for a broader approach to education. Now, I've been on the broader camp, if you haven't guessed yet. But the reformers have been winning. And what I want to point out, they're Democrats and Republicans. This is bipartisan. This is not simply a Republican issue. There are lots of Democrats who embraced it, including the Obama administration. They embraced the idea that you could use pressure to improve schools. Threats. Right? Fire the principals. Fire the teachers. Remember they did that? They did that in Fall River, right? I remember when, well, that was Deborah Gist. That was Rhode Island. Central Falls. I keep mixing them up. They're right next door. Right? They fired all the teachers, and Arnie Duncan said, "Good job." And I said, "Really?" You know what happened? 2 weeks later, they hired them all back. You know why? Because nobody wanted that job in the first place. This is not a serious way to go about improving schools. I was asking the commissioner, who was formerly the superintendent of Lawrence, how's Lawrence doing? Because Lawrence has been under state control now for a long time. He says it's making progress. We don't, I hope so. I hope so, because I was there almost 20 years ago and it was stuck then. Right? And one of my students did a dissertation on Lawrence, and she was describing how they'd staffed the schools with Teach for America teachers. Think about the craziness of that. We take people who are untrained and give them the hardest jobs. Why would we think that strategy would work? I'm glad we don't do that to doctors. You know, take the brand new intern and say, "We need a triple bypass done over here. No one wants to do it. This is for you, kid." Right? Or we don't do that to pilots. You know, we got a storm tonight. We're going to send out that new pilot. No, but we do it to teachers, don't we? We take brand new teachers and ask them to work with the most challenging kids. And then we wonder why they don't want to be teachers after a year or two, because they're burnt out. Right? This is not a serious way to go about improving our schools. So we need to shift. And as I said already, there are several states that are making that shift, that are focused on building capacity in schools, focused on using discipline not to punish kids but to develop character and keep kids connected to learning, focused on building partnerships with parents rather than treating them like consumers. This shift is what's led the largest urban district in North America to be one of the most successful in the world. And that district is Toronto. And if you look at the data, you will see that for the last 20 years, Toronto has made consistent progress for all groups. And Toronto is very diverse. Large immigrant population, poverty still, although it's Canada, and although they have a great free healthcare system and great free preschool, because they get it, universal preschool makes a huge difference, they still have poverty. They still have challenges. But if you read Michael Fullen's book, Coherence, you'll just see the strategy that was used, because if a school is struggling in Toronto, they don't come in to threaten the principal. They look at the data and says, "You know what, you need help in math. We're going to send some math coaches down here to help your teachers." Because they get it. When the kids are struggling, it means the teachers are struggling too. And the teachers need help, because you've got to align the skills of the teachers with the needs of the kids. Is that part of Massachusetts' strategy? No. Because if you were serious about aligning the skills of the teachers with the needs of the kids, the teachers would have to be biliterate, bicultural. They would have to have strong in content and know how to teach kids of different kinds, instead of expecting kids to learn the way they teach. So I'm going to describe some schools that are doing that are engaged in collaborative problem solving. I'd like to point out that Toronto made its progress. For part of the time, they had a crack-smoking mayor. Remember him? And despite a crack-smoking mayor, they still made progress. So if you could do that with a crack-smoking mayor, come on. We should be able to do better than we are. So you have some examples And my former student, Eric Demolinaire, who's at Clark University, who showed up for a minute to say hello, and then he had to go get his kids, was telling me, because I said, I want to talk about University Park Campus High School, which is right here in Worcester, which is a great model. And he said, well, it's not as great as it sounds, okay? I've been there. So I want to admit that I only know the data from afar. And sometimes when you get behind the data and you go into the school, you realize, oh, it's not as great as it seemed. But on paper, they look excellent. And I'd say the same thing is true of Worcester Technical High School. Worcester Tech, a few years ago, there were only 2 urban high schools that got a level 1 rating by the state of Massachusetts. Worcester Tech and Brockton High were the only 2. And Irene Hegarty, not Irene, I forget her first name, Hegarty, everybody? Sheila Hegarty, Principal of the Year. Now, this is a school extremely diverse, but with 4 academies. They're doing career and technical education in ways that get kids into jobs that pay well and allow them to continue their education. Now, I'm not going to say that that's replicable everywhere, but again, Massachusetts state with great resources, intellectual resources, you got high-tech companies all over. We should be embracing our schools to make sure that those resources are available to our kids. And career and technical education is one way to keep kids in schools because they get to see how learning can lead to better earning. So here's another school I work with in Los Angeles, Social Justice Humanitas High School, 100% low income, 100% Latino, 4th highest graduation rate in Los Angeles. Last year, 95% of the kids went to college, several of them to the top public colleges in the state. It's in a very poor neighborhood, a neighborhood surrounded by gangs. They haven't had a fight in the school in over 7 years. Every morning when you visit the school, you come there between 7 and 7:30, you know where you find the principal and many of the staff? On the sidewalk in front of the school, greeting kids. Because they want the kids and their parents to know, you come here, you're safe. You're safe because we're here looking out for you. And as I walk the halls and I see the accomplishments of the school and talk to the teachers, because this is a school where there's very low turnover amongst teachers, I ask the teachers, what's so good about this school? Why is this a good place to work? You know what they say? They say, because we work as a team. We collaborate. We plan together. I said, you plan? They said, we plan every lesson together. I said, why? He said, because this is too hard to do by yourself. We need to give each other feedback. I said, what's the hardest thing about working in a school like this? They said, the feedback from the kids. Because this is the only high school in Los Angeles where the kids evaluate their teachers. And the evaluations are taken seriously. One teacher told me a girl told her that she was disorganized. Said, it hurt my feelings so bad I didn't talk to her for 2 years. But she told me the other day, I'm getting better. Made me feel so good. These are authentic relationships. I was suspicious. When I visited, I thought maybe they're just showing me the good things. So I asked to meet with a group of students, a mix of students. And we were learning about the school. They would tell me about the language of love they've learned to use to talk to their teachers, to talk to their peers, and they even use it to talk to their parents at home. Because sometimes, you know how teenagers can be. And then I asked a question. I said, well, how often are you inspired by what you learn at school? And several kids raised their hand and said, we're inspired every day. I said, I don't believe you. I go to too many schools. I said, what did you learn yesterday? Girl shot up her hand. She said, yesterday, we learned about the forced sterilization of women that was occurring in this country in the 1930s, part of eugenics. We started in biology, learning about eugenics. It was carried over to social studies. And I was so upset, I went home and talked to my parents about it. We went online to go further to understand why it happened, where it happened, who was behind it. You know what happens when kids get a good education? They want more education. They start to learn on their own because they're not satisfied with just doing it for the test. They develop a hunger for learning. That's what we should be after in Massachusetts, not kids who pass the MCAS. That's too low a bar. over and over again. When I see schools that are succeeding at serving Latino kids, and I get to see those schools, I get to see the ones that don't, we see that there's reinforcement of literacy across the content area. Right? It's not just left to language arts or to bilingual teachers. It's happening in math. It's happening in science. We see the culture is affirmed and reinforced, as is the language, because we know that if our kids come out bilingual, bicultural, they're going to be better able to navigate the world. We see early intervention so that if kids who need help, get more time, including summer. Social Justice Humanitas starts their school 3 days before the school year. I said, why? He said, to build community, to get to know the kids. And because we do, kids will tell us things they would have never shared. I said, how do you get them to come 3 days early? He said, we just tell them they have to, and they show up. Part of the culture. There's cultural competence amongst the staff. There's clear and explicit strategy for helping kids plan for the future. And there are partnerships with community-based organizations, nonprofits, hospitals, universities. Again, because schools can't do it all by themselves. So I want to encourage you to look at these schools, and there's good research. We wrote a book, Excellence Through Equity. I'd recommend Karen Chenoweth's book, It's Being Done and How It's Being Done, in which she documents these high-performing, high-poverty schools. Because the good news is poverty is not a learning disability. There's absolutely no evidence that because kids are poor, they can't learn. So don't believe that either. However, if we ignore the needs of the kids who are poor, if we ignore the fact that the kid is having trouble getting homework done because they don't have a stable place to live, when we ignore those needs, the kids with the greatest needs continue to be the kids most likely to fail. And so we need to make sure that we are building capacity in ways that make a difference, extending, which doesn't simply mean more school. It means using after school and summer school and preschool as ways to get kids engaged, get kids involved in learning. Here's an example of what it looks like when you get kids engaged. Look at this. This is an 90-minute algebra class in East LA. East LA, better known for gangs, had more gangs than any community in the United States at one point. All these kids are Latino. All these kids are low income. They're doing 8th grade algebra. Why? Because algebra is the gateway to college. And this teacher's so good, she can stand in the back and talk to me. She does not have to hover over the kids. The kids are in control of learning, which means now she can differentiate support to the kids. She can move amongst them and figure out who needs help, which kids can work together and help each other. This is developmentally appropriate learning, because these are middle schoolers. How many of you teach middle school or have ever taught middle school? What's the first thing you learn? When I taught middle school, I learned you have to make learning fun. If you don't make it fun, what happens? They'll make it fun at your expense. That's what'll happen. It'll be fun one way or another. Right? She's found a way to make it fun because these kids are up out of their seats. They're interacting. They're learning together, which is fun for kids. And you know what they were doing? They were doing culturally relevant math. They were studying, figuring out how to design a floor plan for a house, how to order materials, how many materials, applying what they learned in algebra to something very concrete. And the fact that many of these kids come from families where their parents are doing construction made it something they got right away. This is the highest form of classroom management. How many of you visit schools where they're struggling with classroom management, can't get kids to sit still? You know what the problem is? They're trying to get the kids to sit still. That's the problem. The hardest thing to do if you're in middle school is to sit still for too long. These kids don't have to sit still to learn. They're up out of their seats. They're talking about math. And this teacher's smart enough to know which kids should work together and which kids should never work together, because she knows her students. And knowing your students is an essential part of knowing how to teach your students. Now, these kids are lucky because many of them will go on to Garfield High School when they graduate from Hollenbeck. And Garfield is where Jaime Escalante once taught. And if you haven't seen the movie, Stand and Deliver, I encourage you to watch it. It's still one of the best education movies ever made, and it's a true story. Escalante was an engineer from Bolivia. Decided to stop engineering and go teach high school. He gets to Garfield, and they tell him, well, you're going to teach remedial math because that's all we offer to these kids. And after a day or two, he says, this is a waste of time. This is preparing kids for nothing. They should learn calculus. And the first people to oppose him were his colleagues, said, not these kids, they can't do calculus. He said, oh yeah, watch me. So he starts teaching calculus and decides to offer the advanced placement exam. And they pass. So they assume they must have cheated. So they send in investigators, require the kids to be retested, and they pass again, and again, and again for 19 years in a row. Majority of these kids pass the AP calculus exam. So eventually they sent in researchers to study his methods. They came in from Berkeley, from UCLA, from Stanford, figure out what's this Escalante doing. And they all came back and said the same thing. Said it's nothing but math. Because they didn't understand what he called ganas. He was cultivating ganas in children, the desire to learn. How do you do that? How do you get kids motivated? How do you get kids willing to work hard? Well, you have to expand the horizons. He would take them to aeronautical labs. He said, you see these jobs? They pay well. To get jobs like these, you need calculus. Because a lot of kids don't get it. And then he had to remind them, he said, you're the descendants of people who built pyramids. Math is part of your heritage. It's not something foreign. I met one of his former students. She is the only Latina engineer at Boeing in Southern California. And on her free time, she does robotics in the schools. And I saw her at a robotics event, and she was explaining. She said, I do this because I want to see more engineers like me at places like Boeing. She said, everything you hear about Escalante was true. He was there for us. He pushed us. He got us to come in on Saturdays. He got us to come, to stay late if we had to. Whatever it took, he got us to apply ourselves. He got us to believe in ourselves. She said, he used to come to my soccer games. I said, he came to your soccer games? He said, yeah, but not to cheer me on. He would stand on the sideline and say, I suck at soccer, go back to math. And when he died, there was this great outpouring of former students, many of whom were now professionals, all of whom said one teacher had changed their life. If one teacher can do that, what happens when a whole school is committed to that kind of vision? A vision of getting kids engaged like these kids. So let's not pretend this can't be done. I've seen it done at the Bronx Academy of Language and Technology, in the South Bronx, where my grandmother lived for over 20 years, on Willis Avenue, in the housing projects. And this is another school. 95% of these kids graduate from high school. Most of them, over 90%, take the state exam, the Regents exam, and pass, including in English. And most of these kids were students with interrupted formal education, SIFE students. That means they're not literate in their native language. They didn't go to school regularly in their home countries when they came here. In most places, these kids will be more likely to drop out than anybody else. Well, why don't they drop out at Bronx Academy of Language and Technology? Well, because they know the kids. I asked the kids, what's it like to go to school here? It's just like a family. We take care of each other. We look out for each other. Again, teachers planning together, working together. And with a focus, again, on vocation, because a lot of these kids are undocumented, and many of them won't be able to go to college because of their status. So they want to make sure they're not stuck in low-wage jobs permanently. So when we start to look from schools like these, at schools like these, we see they have a more holistic vision. They're focused on the social and emotional needs of kids. They're focused on working with parents. They're focused on teaching and learning, but they're focused on it in different ways. They're not just covering the material. They're actually looking for evidence that kids are learning. So if Massachusetts is going to make more progress, it's got to start asking different questions. Instead of asking, how do we raise achievement, we should be asking, how do we promote healthy development and get kids excited about learning? You know what happens when we think about it that way? We remember that education should be creative. That education could be powerful if we find ways to get our kids stimulated, right? And let them see how knowledge can be used to solve the problems facing our society and facing the world. Instead of asking how to hold teachers accountable, we should be saying, how do we hold everybody accountable? Starting with the governor, the state legislature, the universities, and the teachers, and the principals, superintendents, school boards, parents, kids. Everybody's got to be accountable. Mutual accountability, not the top-down accountability that we've known. And instead of just focusing on how to close the achievement gap, we should focus on how to close the gaps in opportunity that limit our kids' chances. When we ask questions like these, we start to do the work differently. And as we do, we will start to see places, even places that have struggled for a long time, begin to improve. I was at a classroom in Los Angeles. I work with a high school, Hawkins High School in South Central LA. Had more homicides than any high school in the city last year. Not in the school, but in the neighborhood. I go to a class in LA, I'll tell you, is not optimal learning environment. 38 kids in the class, inexperienced teacher. He's supposedly trying to teach them English. And I'm watching him trying to teach vocabulary, and kids are not paying attention, and they're walking around. And after watching for a while, I came up to him, I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm trying to teach them English." I said, "It's not working, is it?" He said, "Nope." I said, "What do you know about these kids?" He said, "I know they don't speak English." I said, "Well, what else do you know?" He said, "That's all I know." I said, "Well, do you know over half the kids in your room were unaccompanied minors? They came to this country without their parents. That means many of them crossed borders, sometimes several borders on their own." I said, "Do you think you could have done that?" He said, "Honestly, no." I said, "I don't either, because I try to cross legally and I have trouble." Right? So you're teaching incredibly resilient people. That's who you're teaching. They are smart. They are creative. They've figured out how to navigate dangerous obstacles. You're not teaching dummies. And as soon as we start to see the brilliance in our kids and understand that they're capable of so much more, then we will start to approach this work differently. Our kids will rise to the level of our expectations. We must expect more. Thank you.
Just wow. Let's give him another round of applause, please. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Noguera, for your remarks and for inspiring us and really giving us some really wonderful examples to really take home and back to the field. He actually had to run out because he has to catch a flight, so this is why we didn't do Q&A. But I'd like to introduce you to one of my friends and colleagues, Jo Marion, who's on the Peace Committee, and she will be closing us out and providing next steps. I will also say, she's super humble, so she won't say this, that Mary Jo is one of the reasons we have Peace, because she brought together all the leaders that helped put this together, and she is a fighter. She is a fighter. She is truly testimony for what Latinx leadership looks like here in Massachusetts, and certainly is someone who doesn't let us forget that we have a seat at the table. Mary Jo Marion is the Associate Vice President for Urban Affairs at Worcester State University. During her tenure at WSU, she has overseen the university's Latino Education Institute, or LEI, and under her leadership, it has served more families and students, developed new programs, and replicated programs in Springfield and in Southbridge. She has co-authored a number of publications with Worcester State faculty. Mary Jo was also the Associate Director of the Mauricio Gaston Institute of Latino Community Development and Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and has also served as a Program Director for the National Council of La Raza, the nation's premier Latino advocacy organization, where she engaged in research, advocacy, and legislative efforts. She has a master's degree in public policy studies from the University of Chicago. She is also a proud immigrant from Bolivia and has committed much of her professional life to advancing policies positively affecting Latinos in the United States, and we are so grateful to have her in our team.
Thank you, Cynthia. Querida, thank you. All right. So I just want to be quick because I know it's been a long day, but there's 3 things that I want to say. One is thank you. Thank you for the 500 and more of you who came here. Many of you, we had a lot of calls from other folks that wanted to come, but we just didn't have room. So next year, and there will be a next year, we will have a much larger room, and we hope you will all be here as well. The other thing that we wanted to say is you are here because we know that you care and you are real and you want to be part of that, future that we're hoping will come. And we hear you. And when I say we, I mean all of our group. We hear you. We've heard you the whole week and day as people have been calling and trying to get in. And we know that you're ready for something to change. And we all recognize that the same thing can't keep happening or we're gonna go nowhere. So if you're in this group of people like Peas, who have been at it for a long time and who care and wanna be part of that kind of change, then we want you to be part of Peas. And we wanna help. We want to hear more about what you think and where you think we should be headed. You all have a card on the table, and we asked you to take some time to fill it out. If you'd rather do it online, that's another option. But we need to hear from you because we need you to be active and engaged. And when I say active, what we have, what we are hoping to do in the coming years, actually, is to have lots of different ways to get this work done. Our next step is in about 1 month. We'll have some activity at the State House where we hope to inform legal people and lawmakers about the things that we want to see and that change that we want to make happen. And we really want you to inform us about what that might be and be here with Peas. So with that said, I just want to say thank you. It's been a wonderful night and day, because I've been at it since last night, so it's been a wonderful day. And we'll see you soon. We'll see you in a month, and then we will see you for the next 3 years. Join Peas.